In Chapter 9 of Amusing Ourselves to Death, entitled Reach Out and Elect Someone, Neil Postman looks at the ascendancy of the image and what it has meant for capitalism, politics, and American society more generally. Here's a quote from Postman. The move away from the use of propositions in commercial advertising began at the end of the 19th century, but it was not until the 1950s that the television commercial made linguistic discourse obsolete as the basis for product decisions. By substituting images for claims, the pictorial commercial made emotional appeal, not tests of truth, the basis of consumer decisions. The distance between rationality and advertising is now so wide that it is difficult to remember that there once existed a connection between them. That's from pages 127 and 128. The departure from the concept of truth in advertising followed the same slippery slope as the movement from text to image, from idea to feeling, and so on. As documentaries such as The Social Dilemma suggest, this movement has found its apex in social media companies' manipulation of the human limbic system through dopamine, etc. As always, a huge problem in this process is that we were all raised on a diet of the media and advertising world's manipulation of human emotion. We were raised to be emotionally manipulated in this way. The reason for this is obvious. It's good for business to manipulate human emotions. It's good for the current government to have a nation of consumers. Economic growth continues, politicians get reelected, and the populace remains happy. Related to the myth of progress, which we have discussed before, is the myth of continuous growth. For decades now, Americans and citizens of most developed countries have gotten used to the idea that each year would be more economically prosperous than the previous. This is understandable. For decades now, this has been the case. In the long history of humanity, however, our era is an aberration and not the rule. It's only a matter of time before our hubris becomes apparent, and we find that continuous growth is not actually sustainable. Here's another quote from Postman. The television commercial has oriented business away from making products of value and toward making consumers feel valuable, which means that the business of business has now become pseudo-therapy. That's from page 128. According to Wikipedia, the term retail therapy was first used in print in 1986. Here's a quote from Wikipedia. That is the term retail therapy, was first used by Mary Schmick in the 1980s, with the first reference being this sentence in the Chicago Tribune of Christmas Eve 1986. Quote, "We've become a nation measuring out our lives in shopping bags and nursing our psychic ills through retail therapy." End quote. So, obviously, Postman had already been referring to this phenomenon long before this. Regardless of who coined the term, however, it's helpful to note that this shift is a completely modern and a relatively recent one. While the phenomenon appears banal, it is actually a serious problem that leads to devastation on both the personal as well as on the environmental level. Wasting money on things that one doesn't need in the vain hope of filling an inner void that can never be filled by the things one buys leads to constant disappointment and the bottomless desire that results in the destruction of our ecosystem. Postman's concern goes beyond the capitalist manipulation of consumers, however, as he connects this phenomenon with another dangerous concern, the undermining of American democracy and the rule of law. He writes, here's another quote, "What I am saying is that just as the television commercial empties itself of authentic product information so that it can do its psychological work, Image politics empties itself of authentic political substance for the same reason. That's from page 136. As Postman noted at the beginning of the book, most Americans still very much believe that the real threat to democracy will come from overtly authoritarian regimes. The irony, of course, is that while this could eventually be the case, it would only be because Americans themselves have prepared the path to authoritarian control by ceding power to the governments and our technocratic overlords for the proverbial bowl of lentils. The deeper cause of our willingness to give up our freedom for conveniences is that we have allowed ourselves to be manipulated by our deepest desires. Rather than electing politicians based on their worldview, positions, or ideas, Postman wants to show us how, in our narcissism, we now elect the politicians that make us feel good. American capitalism has taught us to worship ourselves by buying things that we believe will make us happy. And American politicians have learned the same lesson. They need to create and sell an image that will make people happy, regardless of what their particular policy or political ideas may be. I'll leave Postman here with the final word. Quote, "How delighted would be all the kings, czars, and fairs of the past and commissars of the present, to know that censorship is not a necessity when all political discourse takes the form of a jest." And that's from page 141. So that is it for today. Thank you, as always, for joining us as we continue our study of Neil Postman's Amusing Ourselves to Death. We'll move on to chapter 10 next week, so please join us for that. And as always, if you haven't already, please download the How Did We Get Here reading list at the link below this video. Thanks again, and have a great weekend.